Hi, it's Katrina. The Pleiades Constellation. The Pleiades Constellation is often known as the Seven Sisters, and it is a star cluster seen in the constellation of Taurus. These stars are some of the most obvious that you can see with the naked eye at night. The stars are distinctly blue and can be seen hovering inside a faint cloud of space dust. They are depicted by almost every ancient society on Earth, from the Greeks to the Chinese, and from the Maya to the indigenous tribes of North America. Everywhere you go on Earth, the Seven Sisters are depicted in one way or another. This star cluster has served as a calendar to help mark seasons for many civilizations. When the cluster appeared, it marked the beginning of navigation season in the Mediterranean. For the Zuni tribe, it was time to plant seeds. For the Druids, when the Pleiades reached its highest point in the sky, it meant that the veil between the dead and the living was at its thinnest. Sometimes you can see 6, not 7 Pleiades stars, and the so-called lost star also seems to have a universal theme. The astronomer Robert Burnham Jr. found the lost Pleiad myth in stories told by European, African, Asian, Indonesian, Native American, and Aboriginal Australian people. And there is a reason for that. The 7th star, Pleione, is different because it is a shell star that varies in brightness, so sometimes it gets lost. But there is no way that ancient people would know this. They just observed that sometimes they could see it and sometimes they couldn't. Each culture has a slightly different story behind the stars. In Greek mythology, the Seven Sisters are the daughters of Atlas and Pleione, and in modern science, they are actually considered siblings as well because they were born from the same cloud of gas and dust 100 million years ago. In Hindu mythology, the stars represent the 6 wives of the 6 sages. Even in the ancient Maori traditions, the stars are seen as a mother with her 6 daughters. The Seven Sisters have been painted on cave walls, displayed in temples, and seen alongside ancient gods all over the earth. But what they all have in common is that they are always depicted as female. But why? This is the big question. Nowhere in the ancient world are the 7 stars of the Pleiades constellation depicted as being men. And while it does make sense that different ancient cultures would draw the same stars, after all, everyone would have seen the constellation no matter where they were, it's quite curious that they all showed the stars as women, mothers or daughters, sisters or wives. The Seven-Headed Deity. One of the great coincidences of the ancient world is a 7-headed deity, what you might call a hydra or a many-headed dragon, seemingly worshipped by various civilizations. From ancient Greeks to the Aztec, this 7-headed unknown being played a key part in religious worship. The Torah mentions a 7-headed hydra in the Bible, and a bizarre depiction of a 7-headed creature was even found in Russia, carved as an ancient petroglyph 5,000 years before today. But just what is this thing, and why were so many cultures fascinated by it? The truth is, we don't know. In Aztec lore, it is a fertility goddess named Chicomeocoatl, and she's described as a woman with 7 snake heads. In Mexico, archaeologists have found depictions of the goddess holding the sun as a shield. This shield looks identical to an object that also appears in a Russian petroglyph of another 7-headed creature. They're almost exactly the same, yet they were drawn thousands of years apart and on opposite ends of the earth. Next, we have to look at the goddess Manas from Hindu mythology. She is the goddess queen of snakes, also seen depicted with 7 snake heads sprouting from a glowing orb behind her head. Then there's the 7-headed deity called Mushman, worshipped by the Assyrians and the Sumerians. She also has 7 snake heads. And let's not forget the legendary Hydra from Greek mythology. The Greeks took it even further when they introduced Medusa. In the end, deities with 7 heads, usually snake heads, can be found all over the world. Different cultures, different places, and different times all have a similar mythical or godlike entity. Cosmic coincidence. If you've ever looked up at the night sky and thought to yourself, that can't be real, there's no way, you're not alone. Space is a strange place, and so too is our very own moon. In fact, the moon has so many strange coincidences, it almost seems as if it was placed in its exact spot on purpose by someone who was extraordinarily good at math. The real coincidence has to do with the size of the moon, the sun, and the position of all 3 celestial objects. You've probably seen an eclipse at least once in your life, and you may have wondered how the small little moon was able to blot out the sun. After all, isn't the moon significantly smaller than the sun? The answer is yes. The moon is 400 times smaller than the sun. Coincidentally, the moon is 400 times closer to Earth than the sun is. These are exact numbers we're talking about, making it seem somewhat impossible that things ended up the way they are. The only reason that eclipses work is because of the number 400. If the moon was only 399 times closer to Earth, a full eclipse would never be possible. Biblical archaeology. In 1846, an Assyrian obelisk was found in northern Iraq. On this obelisk was a reference to Jehu, the Hebrew king from the 9th century BC. It was the first time that an archaeological discovery corresponded to something written in the Bible. Ever since, more and more archaeological discoveries have corroborated stories, people, or events in the Bible. In fact, in 1959, Rabbi Dr. Nelson Glueck declared that not a single archaeological discovery has contradicted a reference from the Bible. What this means is that nothing ever found has disproved a biblical story. Archaeology has done nothing except confirm stories and myths spoken of in the most popular book ever written. Now, is this a coincidence? If it is, it's the biggest one in history. Back in 1968, an ancient home from the 1st century was identified as the real house of the Apostle Peter. And in 1990, there was an ossuary discovered with the inscription of the name Caiaphas, the high priest who instigated the execution of Jesus. In 2021, scientists learned of a cataclysmic event in which an asteroid decimated an ancient city from the Middle Bronze Age, which likely inspired the tale of the biblical city of Sodom. Dr. Stephen Collins, who was involved in the investigation, says the ancient city was literally melted by an exploding cosmic airburst, resulting in destruction equivalent to 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. But because the ancient people hadn't known that, they simply thought it was God smiting the whole city. Basically, all of these archaeological discoveries point to one truth. The stories in the Bible, though probably not 100% accurate, were often at least inspired by real historical events. Alien cave art. Thousands of years ago on the Colorado Plateau, ancient people painted images of beings from other worlds and maybe even other dimensions. This Native American artwork was left behind on rock panels all throughout the Southwest, with the oldest being the Barrier Canyon pictographs. According to the National Endowment for the Humanities, some of these paintings could be up to 9,000 years old, with many confirmed to be at least 5,000 years old. Some of the images painted here are animals and other seemingly ordinary creatures, but some are large, human-like beings with no arms or legs and giant eyeballs. They are most likely different deities or attempts to represent spirits. The paintings are made of red ochre, and some by our standards are a bit scary. But what religion doesn't have a terrifying being? Of course, some people claim they represent visitors from another planet. But here's what's so strange. There has also been mysterious rock art discovered in Siberia that dates back to around the same time, 5,000 years ago, and shows the same type of alien-like creatures, possibly even interdimensional travelers. To this day, the connection between the two prehistoric sites has evaded scientists. Nobody can figure out how people from before the dawn of civilization could have possibly found inspiration in each other to create such similar artwork. What some people say is that the only logical explanation is that prehistoric humans from all over the world really did witness beings from beyond our planet and drew them on the rocks. Violet Jessup. Violet Jessup was born in Argentina in 1887. Her parents were Irish immigrants, and she is either the unluckiest woman or the luckiest woman in history, depending on how you look at it, and also the victim of the weirdest string of historical coincidences ever. As a child, Violet got tuberculosis, and doctors told her parents that she wasn't going to make it. Somehow she made it through and lived a long and exciting life. When her father died, she moved with her mother and family back to England and tried to become a stewardess on a boat. At 21 years old, she was having trouble because employers thought that her youth and beauty was going to cause problems. So she made herself look as ugly as possible and dressing in frumpy clothes. Then she was hired by White Star Line in 1908. She was working on board the ship called the Olympic, but one day it crashed into the HMS Hawk and nearly sank. This was Violet's first ship disaster. While both ships were severely damaged, they did not sink. Several years later, Violet got a job working on the Titanic. Considering it was supposed to be an unsinkable ship, it seemed like a good deal. Unfortunately, we all know what happened with that. But Violet was lucky and escaped the sinking ship, getting away from the disaster completely unharmed. In her memoir, she wrote that a ship's officer ordered us into the lifeboat first to show some women it was safe, and the lifeboats were rescued by the Carpathia. By this point, you would think Violet had had enough of boats. Two ship disasters isn't a coincidence, it's a warning. But then, Violet went on to serve as a nurse on the ship the Britannic. This was just before World War I, with the ship operating in the Aegean Sea off the coast of Greece. The ship accidentally ran into an underwater mine that had been placed by a German U-boat, and Violet almost died a second time as the ship began to sink. She was unable to reach a lifeboat, so she jumped overboard. She was sucked under the ship and hit her head, but somehow she survived. Later, a doctor told her that she had fractured her skull and was lucky she didn't drown. In the end, Violet continued working on boats despite all the disastrous events she'd gone through. She retired at the age of 61 and died in her 80s from heart failure. The Lady of Elche. The Lady of Elche is a mysterious artifact discovered back in 1897 on a private Spanish estate. To this day, nobody knows the exact origin of the artifact, with some saying she may have been an Iberian princess, a goddess, or just a simple statue. She is considered to be one of the most outstanding examples of sculpture artwork ever found from the ancient world. It was actually a young farmer who came across her while clearing an area on the farm for plants. But here's where things get a little strange. The statue of the Lady of Elche looks almost identical to Princess Leia from Star Wars. She has the exact same coils of hair and arguably a pretty similar face. But the coincidences go beyond science fiction. One of the main theories surrounding the Lady of Elche is that she was a representation of an Atlantean goddess. One of the reasons for this is that the statue is simply too well made to have been crafted in Spain during the pre-Christian era, according to some. The detail and curious headdress is just too intricate. Most archaeologists agree she was carved around the 4th century BC, and that at the time, she was decorated in vivid colors of red and blue. But it's the exquisite artwork that makes people think she may have been from Atlantis, since no other people of the time, at least none in Europe, could have crafted such a beautiful piece of artwork. Of course, this is not really giving much credit to the people of the ancient world, who I think were much more advanced than we give them credit for. The winged sun disk. The winged sun disk is one of the oldest and most important symbols that can be found throughout all of the ancient world. It can be seen in many different variations, from the Sumerians to the Assyrians. The winged sun disk is a sign often associated with royalty and power. It can be found in the ruins of ancient Egypt, the dusty relics of Persia, and even in more obscure archaeological sites in Anatolia. The symbol itself is almost always a circular disk being carried on the wings of a bird. In Egypt, the bird is the god Horus, and the disk in the middle represents the sun. However, there are a lot of different variations of this. For example, sun disks can also be found being held by a pair of cobras with opened hoods. Then there's different symbolism. In China, the winged sun disk is a symbol of perfection, while in India it symbolizes a rise to a higher sphere of existence. And then there is even the occult to consider, in which the winged sun disk is a symbol of power and often used with tarot cards. As for its origins, the winged sun disk appeared in the Old Kingdom of Egypt from between 2600 and 2180 BC, before eventually being adopted in Asia at around 2000 BC. The symbol moved into the Kingdom of Judah in the 8th century BC, and it can still be seen in pop culture today. Nobody knows exactly why this seemingly ordinary depiction of the sun riding on the wings of a bird managed to spread throughout the world and persist for over 4,000 years. That it's one of the longest-lasting symbols in human history. Flying serpents. Ancient Egyptians and ancient Mesoamericans never met, and yet somehow they both had an obsession with flying serpent deities. They both built pyramids, often in rows of 3 aligning with important stars in the sky, and they both developed impressive calendars. The cultural similarities between the two ancient civilizations is hard to ignore. For example, the Aztec culture worshipped Quetzalcoatl, a feathered snake god from between the years 1200 BC to 1521, when the Spanish came and basically bulldozed them and their religion to the ground. Before this, from 3000 BC and onwards, the Egyptians worshipped the goddess of the pharaohs Isis, whom they often depicted as being a feathered serpent. In other words, both gods were flying serpents covered in feathers. They looked identical, but nobody from either civilization ever made it across the ocean to see the other, making historians wonder why they had chosen to worship the exact same god. Some have suggested the feathered serpent may have been a real creature witnessed by both cultures. Even before the Aztecs, The earlier civilization of the Olmec were creating sculptures of jaguar-human hybrids that looked an awful lot like Egyptian sphinxes. Could these have been real creatures that had come and gone with no physical trace of them left behind? In any case, both of these cultures were fascinated by this depiction of a flying snake bird god. The Great Henges. Nobody knows why ancient people built stone henges all over the world. Wherever ancient civilizations rose up, henges of huge rock boulders were constructed. Stonehenge just so happens to be the most famous, located in rural England. But the truth is that similar stone henges can be found all the way from the frigid mountains to hot deserts. We have the Carnac stones in Brittany, France, a grouping of over 3,000 stones that have been around since 4500 BC. There is the Rejum El Hiri in Israel, a megalithic monument of over 40,000 rocks. It was created around the year 3000 BC, and its purpose still remains unknown to archaeologists. Then there are some in Spain, other parts of Europe, and several countries of Africa. Then, of course, there are more stone circles all around the UK. The Drombeg stone circle in Ireland, the Rollright stones in England, and the Callanish stones in Scotland. This is just to name a few. The similarities between the different stone structures are uncanny, and yet nobody can come to a conclusion as to why our ancient ancestors all seem to have gotten the same idea to build the same thing at the same time. Thanks for watching! What do you think is the craziest historical coincidence? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button and come back soon for another awesome video. See you later! Bye!